And we're live.
So we're just going to give it a couple minutes to let people get signed in. I'll get started in about 1 minute. And get started. Welcome everybody to the live fully active webinar brought to you by the Monroe County Bar Center for Education. Today's August 6, 2020. This program is called Deconstructing, Defund. What does defund the police mean and what are the implications? The program is hosted by the Lawyers Coalition for Racial and Social Justice, which is a coalition between MCBA, the RBBA, and GRAWA. Coalition has been active for a number of years now. It's currently co-chaired by Judge Karen Morris and Dwayne Basco, who's also one of our speakers tonight. To those of you who are seeking CLE credit, you do need to fill out your affirmation form and evaluation sheet at the end of the program and email it back to Danielle Medeus at MCBA. Once you do that, you will receive your certificate of attendance by email. Also, if you're seeking CLE credit, you do need to attend the program in its entirety, and there's a CLE code that I'll read during the program that you'll have to jot down. During this Zoom presentation, you're only going to be able to see and hear the panelists and myself, but we do encourage you to submit questions that arise during the panelist discussions through the Q&A feature. If you're on a regular computer, I believe it shows up in the bar at the bottom of your screen, and if you're on a tablet or a phone, I think it shows up at the top. The second half of the program is going to be a Q&A for the panelists, so we want you to go ahead and submit those questions. So I'm going to give you a really brief introduction to the topic and how the program's going to go, and we're going to get right into the panelist discussion because I know you did not join to hear me talk about this. I'm Erin Almuji. I'm a relatively recent transplant to Rochester. I'm a commercial litigator with Woods Oviatt. I've been involved with the coalition for the past year, and I'm currently the acting secretary for the group. And while I'm very passionate about the issues of racial and social justice that the coalition focuses on, I do not purport to be an expert on tonight's topic, and like many of you, I'm looking forward to learning a lot from our panelists. Program tonight is intended to unpack what's meant when we say defund police, explore differing perspectives on the topic, and highlight some specific legal issues that are likely to impact whether and how changes to policing can be accomplished. During the first half of the program, we're going to hear from each of our panelists in turn, and I'm going to introduce them all more fully just prior to their presentations. I believe they should show up right now at the bottom of your screen, so I'm going to say their names now and just ask each one to kind of give a wave or a high sign so you know who I'm talking about. Joining us tonight is Ashley Gant, AJ Derwin, Dwayne Basco, and Chief David Cathaldi. Following the presentations of those four panelists, we're going to have a Q&A portion, and we're going to ask the panelists the questions that you submit during the program, as well as any that were emailed to the coalition in advance. Finally, we'll wrap up the program at the end. The last couple of minutes, each panelist will have the opportunity to do a sort of a wrap up or a closing statement for a couple of minutes at the end. So let's get started with our first panelist. Ashley Gant is a social justice activist in every sense of the word. She's been an instrumental force in affecting policy changes in the areas of criminal justice and bail reform, among others, across New York State. Ashley's the civil rights organizer for the New York Civil Liberties Union. She's played an active role in the Black Lives Matter movement in Rochester, including co-founding the organization Free the People Rock, and which shines light on issues such as mass incarceration, police brutality, and the school to prison pipeline. We are honored to have Ashley join us this evening, And Ashley's going to be talking about what do we mean when we say defund? What are the goals behind the defund movement? Understanding that interpretations and expectations can differ among proponents of defunding, and how do those who are intimately involved with these issues hope or expect to see this movement affect change here in Monroe County? So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Ashley.
Can you guys hear me? So hi, everyone. First, thank you to Jill Paperno and MCBA for inviting me. I really appreciate the invite and the opportunity to be here tonight to share on this panel with the rest of the panelists. So I'm going to talk about what it means to defund the police and what we mean when we say it. I know for a lot of folks, when you hear defund the police, it's a very scary thing, and people automatically translate defund to abolish. So first I want to say that defund means defund. Specifically what we're asking for is right now in Rochester, the police department receives almost $100 million. We've gone through that budget and we see what it goes to. A lot of it is the pensions, military riot gear. Some of it goes to community outreach and programs. And what we say as people of color living in communities that are over-policed, we know that we can't even walk outside the store without seeing police officers. We know that police solve 29% of crimes committed in Rochester in the totality, right? And as one of my good friends said, we know that you can't get a 29% on your test and pass. You can't get a 29% in school and go to the next grade. So what we're saying is, because police officers are not necessarily stopping crime in our communities, we would like to see some of the funds that the police officers have go to things like housing, healthcare, mental health places, diversion programs, and we would like to see it go to treatment centers. We know that a huge percent of the crimes that's committed in Rochester are misdemeanors, and a lot of them are petty larceny, which is poverty-based crimes. So we're saying, instead of arresting people and criminalizing people for being in poverty, how about we take some of that money and get to the root of the issue? Again, it's a very scary topic. This is not just a conversation that's happening in Rochester, it's happening across the nation. So yeah, that's what we mean. I know it's going to be a very hefty discussion tonight around it. I know the sound of defunding the police or the words defund is very scary to some folks, but for us who live in very over-policed communities, it's been a long time coming, and we know that this system and this structure is built on the backs of poor people and people of color. So when we say defund the police, we mean take some of those resources and reallocate it into the community. So yeah, that wasn't 10 minutes, but that's what I have. Thank you guys again.
Thank you, Ashley, and there'll definitely be questions that come back. I'm going to introduce our next speaker is AJ Derwin. AJ is a local attorney. He's a vocal advocate of police accountability here in Monroe County. AJ is a member of the Police Accountability Board Alliance and was instrumental in establishing the Rochester Police Accountability Board. We're grateful that AJ could join us tonight. And AJ is going to focus on the topic of police contracts with their municipalities. When you talk about the issues of regulating police conduct and accountability, a lot of it is dictated by the terms of the contracts that these officers have with their municipalities, which as a general matter, I believe are negotiated through their unions in the collective bargaining process. And the specific terms of those contracts can have a lot to do with when we're trying to advocate for reforms relating to internal discipline and accountability. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to AJ.
Thank you, and thanks for having me tonight, and thanks for everyone who's joining us for this discussion. I look forward to hearing your questions after the panelists get a chance to speak. So first, let me start off by just saying that I'm not speaking on behalf of my employer, but rather from my experience campaigning for police accountability in Rochester. And that experience has I've come into contact with the police union's contract, the Locust Club contract, and I've since had an opportunity to look at it and to review it with an eye towards what it means with respect to defunding and for accountability issues. So just by brief way of background regarding the contract, the current contract, I believe, expired in or around 2016, and there have been ongoing negotiations with the police union to reformulate a new contract, but my understanding is no new contract has been formed. So they're kind of just operating based on this old contract. But according to the old contract, there's a provision towards the end, it's Article 30, And in that provision, it discusses how it's Section 1 of Article 30, and it indicates that the entire contract is subject to appropriation of funds by City Council, meaning that City Council has the power to use those funds or to delegate those funds to the police department or to withhold them if they so choose. And the contract would not be binding on whether or not City Council has to release those funds. If they wanted to, City Council could withhold and could not release the funds. Similarly, the city charter also confirms that understanding. The city charter also indicates that the only way to get funds released from the city budget is from an act by City Council. So City Council really does have the power to defund and control how those funds get used. Further, the civil service law in New York anticipates possible downsizing of public employees such as police officers. In Article 5, Section 80, it indicates that there could be such consolidation or abolition of functions, curtailment of activities, or otherwise. And so therefore, under the state law, the civil service law, the city charter, and the police union contract, there's no legal impediment to defunding. Rather, it seems like there's more of a political obstacle. And that gets into why the contract exists in the first place, which is collective bargaining for police officers. And so there is a growing body of data across the country suggesting that police unionization increases rates of misconduct and doesn't really affect much else except for officers' compensation. They get paid a little more if they unionize, but it doesn't do things like change or decrease the crime rate, or it also doesn't decrease or mitigate officers who are injured in the line of duty. Rather, it protects officers who have done something wrong. And further, to another point that Ashu was raising related to sort of the politics and what motivation for defunding is the clearance rate, or how often crimes are solved. If you look at Rochester, there's some good data that the FBI has sort of tracking the amount of crimes over time in Rochester and how often those crimes are solved. And the solve rate or otherwise known as the clearance rate is abysmally low for many crimes, including property crimes, which are the most common crime that's reported in Rochester. So the union contract wouldn't prevent City Council from deeming that there might be better ways of dealing with public safety issues, better ways of dealing with poverty than with funding the police, which doesn't appear to have been working with respect to dealing with those issues. The union contract does not say that a particular number of officers have to be on the force, and we know that the largest part of the police budget is personnel. It's officers on the force who are getting paid. And so therefore, a downsizing of the police department would be a way to defund and would not be against the police department contract, the city charter, or the New York State civil service law. So I think I'll leave it there and open it up to questions after the other panelists speak, and I look forward to hearing from you all.
Thank you, AJ, very much. So our next speaker is Dwayne Basco. As well as being the co-chair of our coalition, Dwayne is a local commercial litigator here in Rochester and is active in countless bar association committees and community organizations. I don't doubt that he is a familiar face to many of you. We're thankful that he agreed to speak this evening. Dwayne is consistently recognized for professional achievements and accomplishments as an attorney, and one area in which he focuses his practice is labor and employment law, and that makes him well able to address our next topic, which is New York's Taylor Law, or the Public Employees Fair Employment Act, which, among other things, grants public employees like police officers the right to organize and be represented by employee organizations in negotiations with public employers. The rights and procedures set out in the Taylor Law intersect with the defunding conversation in the context of regulating police conduct. So I am going to turn it over to.
All right, thank you. So for those that aren't familiar with the Taylor Law, I wasn't myself until I took a deep dive into this issue. And that's regarding the Taylor Law. The purpose and objective of the Taylor Law is to protect the public by assuring at all times that orderly and uninterrupted operations and functions of the government and civil servants continue. Speaking to what AJ was referring to as far as when the contract, police union contract is up, they're able to continue under the old contract because of the provisions of the Taylor Law, which mandates that during the negotiations, that if an agreement is not reached, that the terms and conditions of the previous collective bargaining agreement, CBAs, will continue until such time. Oftentimes people conflate the two regarding defunding. When we're talking about defunding, we're referring to a reallocation of funds versus disciplinary actions and reform in that regard. When it comes to disciplinary actions, the Taylor Law does provide that are in the articles, civil service articles 75 and 76, that the collective bargaining agreement will determine how disciplinary actions are controlled. They have the same rights as far as being in front of an arbitrator, things of that nature. However, there is a caveat with the Taylor Law, and that is that the local legislation does have some power over that. There's a grandfather clause that is initiated and that was expounded upon in the latest Court of Appeals case, which is a 2017 case, City of Schenectady versus the New York State Public Employment Board. And that simply states that wherever a state legislative law or ordinance is in place prior to the enactment of the 1967 Taylor Law, that will govern, so that disciplinary actions that were already allocated to a city or a municipality actor will take precedence over any of the collective bargaining agreements that was laid out, so that the disciplinary actions are going to be determined by that individual and will not be negotiated for in the CBA. So in Rochester, there was some issues regarding that in the latest ruling by Judge Art that stripped away the disciplinary powers of the Police Accountability Board. I believe that was sometime back in either March or April that decision came down, and that might be under further appeal. As it relates to the defunding portions of it, there are some caveats with that as well, and that's where the defunding movement is gaining steam, and that's because even though the collective bargaining agreement governs how salaries are determined, pensions and benefits, things of that nature, the overall funding of the program itself, the legislature has a lot of leeway in that, so that they can defund and take away allocations from the police. And then it's up to the they're going to collectively bargain as far as how layoffs or how the defunding is going to affect the actual officers. So there is going to be some type of negotiation involved when you start talking about reallocating funds from police and cutting police. There's also another movement centered around how to incorporate or get around the Taylor Law, in that the reallocation of some of the most expensive portions of the police forces dealing with benefits and pensions. And pensions are guaranteed, and that's an expensive portion of it, but there's also an expensive portion as far as the allocation of benefits in regards to medical benefits. After 20 years and you retire from the police force, and there's a gap between 65 when Medicaid will cut in to when the retire age is there. And between that portion, oftentimes the municipality is picking up the full cost of that medical insurance. So when you talk about defunding police, there's ways in which you can operate within the Taylor Law in order to take away money and negotiate some of the benefits where you're not cutting necessarily the police force, and you're still reallocating money in order to fund other civil services, versus taking away the money up front and then negotiating the layoffs and things of that nature moving forward. I'll stop there, and if there's any further questions, we can address that.
Thank you, Dwayne. Okay, Chief David Cathaldi is our next and last speaker. Chief Cathaldi is a 25-year veteran of the police force who also served in the United States Air Force. Chief Cathaldi has been with the Brighton Police Department since 1999, has held the positions of sergeant, lieutenant, and captain prior to being named chief of the Brighton Police Department last year. We appreciate him joining us this evening. Chief Cathaldi will give us a perspective of law enforcement on the defund movement, both with respect to the policy goals behind it and the various methods that have been and are being employed to effectuate it, and how the defund movement could potentially play out locally here in Monroe County. I'll hand it over to you, Chief.
Can you hear me? Thank you for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be here tonight, and it sounds like this is going to be an excellent panel presentation. If you don't know and we're not aware, the governor has issued an executive order that requires police departments, every municipality that has a police department, to reimagine what policing looked like. And I think this is a very timely discussion because we've been holding community forums, two recently, but prior to that, since 2016, we've held summits. And I think it's very important to hear back from the community in what exactly they want from their police. Much of what some of the panelists have already discussed, I think you're going to find that police executives have the same feelings. Everything seems to be put on, all societal ills are seen that they're put on the shoulders of the police. You can just see in recent times with the social distancing and masking, who's that left to? Let's give it to the police. Just a few examples. You have a fireworks problem in the city of Rochester. Rather than code enforcement in the fire department, who do they want to give it to? The police. So I think that these are very timely discussions. So we have a much smaller police department, being an inner-ring suburb where we only have 45 police officers. My budget's about $8.8 million. And I know that sounds like a lot of money. And the panelists were spot on. About 10% of my budget is discretionary. And I've said this very openly about defunding and reimagining the police. Please, and I'm asking the community this with all seriousness, let me know what types of calls for service you want me to stop handling. If you start talking about cutting budgets, with 10% of my budget that's discretionary, I still need to have the ability to buy vehicles to get the police officers to those calls for service. And I would just remind people that, and I've heard a lot of the discussion that we can put calls for service off to social workers and other services within the county. Brighton doesn't offer those services independently. Those are all offered through Monroe County. So defunding the Brighton Police Department or cutting my budget is going to ultimately impact the number of personnel that I have. So just an across-the-board cut to my budget is going to limit the ability for me to provide the valued service that I believe that the residents in the town of Brighton want and deserve. It's very rare that I go to a community meeting in the town of Brighton and I'm asked to provide less police service. Most people want more police service, whether it's something as very mundane as traffic problems in the neighborhood. They want to see more police in their neighborhoods. And going back to the two discussions that we have had, I'm beginning to hear the same thing. They're not calling for defunding of the police department. They're actually requesting to possibly add more funds to the police for better training, better hiring, better the ability to vet people, our new hires and candidates. That all takes money. So again, I'll keep my remarks brief. I really do look forward to this panel discussion, and I'll end there.
Thank you very much. We have moved right along. We anticipated the panelists taking a little bit longer, so I was gonna read the CLE code, but I'm gonna wait and read it in a little bit. I do have a number of questions that have been submitted, so I'm gonna start working through those, and I'm sure more will be coming in as we go. The first question was for Ashley Gant. The question is, what percentage of the police budget are you or the groups that you work with proposing be redirected?
Can you hear me? So we're asking that the police budget be cut in half by 50%. Right now, I think city council is talking about less than 1%, if even 1%. Not that, you know, I don't think that we think that we're going to get 50%, but we're definitely not okay with just 1% being cut.
I will say, if there are other panelists that also want to respond to that question or to chime in on the issue, unmute yourself. Go ahead. Go ahead. Oh, everybody does. Okay,
So,
I'm gonna let go ahead, AJ, you can go ahead, and then we'll work our way down.
So just responding to what sort of the chief said and sort of linking it with the question. So I heard the chief say that, you know, so cutting the police budget would mean or fewer police services, and people seem to be asking for some more services. I think this might be, in some situations, a failure of imagination for what alternative services could be. Because I think that, you know, as the chief acknowledged at the beginning of, you know, of what he was saying, is we've asked police to do a huge number of tasks, and it would be impossible for any one person to be adequately trained and really well qualified to do all of those tasks simultaneously at a moment's notice. What we need are more specialized sorts of ways to deal with specific sorts of problems that we see in our community. Though, you know, dealing with someone in a mental health crisis is different than dealing with someone who in the throes of drug addiction. And we might have sort of a mental health response to someone in a mental health crisis, and, you know, a drug treatment or that sort of medical response with respect to someone who's addicted to drugs or that's causing a problem. And both of those are different than another underlying issue, which is poverty. So we might want to think, when we're thinking about defunding and just limiting the, you know, the size and the role of policing in our communities, what we don't mean is we're going to do that and then do nothing else. What it would mean is to replace all of those things that we've been sending police to do for a long time, but trying to deal with those things in a little bit of a different way. Those can include both short-term sorts of solutions, and so we might need crisis management, you know, with like social workers or mental health professionals. And some of those systems need to be designed. As the chief acknowledged, that we don't see those in every single community, but everyone in all communities should have access to those. And it should be, you know, there shouldn't be a financial impediment for people being able to afford it. But that's what we see. And so if we could actually provide these services in an alternative way, it might actually be cheaper to address the underlying social issues rather than just, you know, sending in police, which have limited means of addressing all of these issues. You know, if your real ability to address it is because you have the threat of arrest, you have a gun, or, you know, you can threaten someone with incarceration, that's not the best way to solve a variety of our social problems. And there are got to be better ways to do it. So we can think of long-term solutions of addressing poverty, and we can think of short-term solutions for crisis intervention if need be to take those 911 calls. But ultimately, we don't need the police to be doing everything. We can dramatically scale back and still address these social problems.
I was just going to touch off of what AJ was referring to. There are programs like that throughout the country. One of the latest ones that was getting a lot of publicity was the Cahoots program that's out in Oregon. But with Cahoots, that's a program that's over 30 years old right now. They began the program, I believe, in 1989. Some of the numbers that they have, though, and that's for those that aren't aware of Cahoots, that's a program that joins social workers with mental health professionals to respond to certain calls that would normally have gone to police officers. And their latest stats indicated that they've received over 24,000 calls that normally would have went to police officers that go to them in order for them to respond to mental health issues that are going on. Out of that 24,000 calls, only about 20% of them needed to have police backup after they were already called out. And they were able to see a substantial savings of $8.5 million in running a program like that. So they are actually saving money on their budget by having that implemented. Now, full disclosure, this town in Oregon is only about 170,000 people, and Rochester is almost 7 times that. As far as scale wise, it's not apples and oranges, it's apples and oranges, but I believe that there are scenarios in which a program such as that can be utilized. Now it takes time, and it's going to take a commitment from police and local police unions in order to partner up with social workers and mental health professionals in order to form a program such as that. So that's one side. And the other side, as far as the actual budget is concerned, I just want to be clear that it was around a 5% cut is what the legislation had come back with, about $5 million of worth of cut or reallocation to other social programs is what was proposed. So
I'm just going to let Chief Cathaldi chime in real quick, Ashley, but I'm going to let you answer before I move on to the next question. Go ahead, Chief.
You bring up some really good points, and is a direct response to Dwayne, the Cahoots program. And I think we've done a bad job marketing our programs and what we actually do here in Monroe County. I know the city of Rochester, I think there was a press conference the other day, they had over 2,000 mental health responses with their FIT team. And I'll bring that back to what we do here in Brighton. We actually have been in partnership with the Office of Mental Health probably for the past 20 years. That partnership has really expanded since about 2016. So 100% of our staff here in the town of Brighton are mental health first aid certified. And so what that does in a nutshell is it helps the officers identify people in crisis to realize who they're interacting with before those interactions turn violence, because we know that about 25% of officer-involved shootings happen with a person that's experienced a mental health crisis. So what we've done here is we've taken a very proactive approach. We have one member that's assigned to a staff member from the Office of Mental Health. It's called FIT, Forensic Intervention Team. And rather than wait for those calls for service to come in, they proactively go out and they address the needs in the community from those residents who we know have mental health issues. Rather than wait for them to call in crisis, we're proactively doing that. And that officer is working with that specialist with the Office of Mental Health behind the scenes, making sure that they're staying within their plan, making sure they're taking their medication, and trying to get them the best level of service. Just recently, to Dwayne's point, a lot of times the uniform in and of itself in a marked police car has a very negative connotation with somebody that's having a mental health issue. So I'm looking at a way to possibly have a much softer approach where an officer may have a polo shirt on and maybe khakis and an unmarked vehicle to partner with that person from the Office of Mental Health to go out and proactively engage with those people. I am looking at that, but obviously there's staffing issues involved in a lot of other factors. But I think that's a very good point, and I think we've done a pretty poor job actually in advertising what we do and what the Office of Mental Health does. But we do have a very strong relationship in Monroe County with the Office of Mental Health.
Go ahead, Ashley. I know you wanted to chime in as well.
I just wanted to comment on the chief saying that, the calls that you're getting are from people who not necessarily want to defund the police, but really want to get more services. So give the police more money to get more services. And I want to just say we have to pay attention to where those calls are coming from, because while I believe that every police department needs to be defunded, I'm talking about Rochester, New York. I'm talking about communities of color that have been over-policed for so long. And when we see the rate of crime, it's not that people of color are more dangerous. It's not that people of color are worse people. It's that people of color are concentrated in poverty, and it's on purpose in one community. And now, and that concentration of poverty is on purpose. And now the police department is saying, give us $100 million so we can fix it. When the system, this system created it. So instead of criminalizing people for poverty, I think we should be trying to figure out, how do we eradicate poverty? One. The other thing is, those calls that you're talking about, I'm 100% sure that they are not coming from people who live in my community. And I've had this conversation with the chief here in Rochester. I sat on city council calls where I've been on city council Zoom meetings where people were calling and calling and calling, and all of these people were saying defund the police. So like when we talk about people calling, asking for more resources, we just need to be very clear about who those people are, because it's not the people in over-policed communities who are being criminalized, arrested, and sent to jail and prisons every single day.
I think we probably agree on more than what you think we do. So I would point back to, how we got to this problem of over-policing. And, I don't like to speak about other municipalities, but let's take a look at the city of Rochester. I think if we drew a circle around where the majority of that crime is, we would find out within that circle. I would probably agree with you. There's a lot of policing in that area that's known as precision policing. And I agree with you when you draw that circle around that area. We can debate all day long how that circle got there and how that concentration of poverty got there. We can see the recent articles from the Democrat and Chronicle about the covenants and the real estate. I agree with you, but the simple fact is we are there. And those people living within that circle of the precision policing that I'm talking about, yes, you could say that they're over-policed, but is that where the violence is occurring? Is that violence occurring because of poverty? Yes, I agree with you. Yes, we need to fix poverty. Yes, we need to fix education. Until we can fix that, I think, in my opinion, is that we're so focused on the police, we're forgetting the bigger picture.
Can I just respond and say, like, when we talk about the majority of that crime and we use the word violence, we know that 86% of the crime that is committed in Rochester is not violent crime. It is misdemeanors. And the biggest majority of those misdemeanors are petty larceny. And it's from places like Wegmans, Family Dollar, Rite Aid, people stealing food or whatever. Like, so I just want to just be very clear, like when we use the word violence, let's not try to make it seem like in Rochester, it's the violence and that's why people are there. No, they're literally stealing. I know a man that went to prison for stealing a can of sardines, literally here in Rochester. And I'm sure his previous record had an impact on that, but it shouldn't even matter because it's a can of sardines. So like those are the crimes that are happening, 86% of them.
I'm gonna chime in real quick, and I think there is certainly validity to the point that at some level, the Brighton versus Rochester issue is a little bit of apples and oranges. And we did initially, Chief Singletary was invited to participate and had been intending to and had a conflict, which could have added a little bit more as another dynamic to that conversation. And we can hope to have future conversations that involve the Rochester.
And Chief David, I appreciate you being here. I actually like you a lot. So thank you. I appreciate you being here. This is fantastic, but I am gonna move on because we've gotten a lot of questions, which is wonderful. I'm trying to group them because so many have come in. Can we ask each panelist to give their views on Governor Cuomo's requirement? There's two questions that came in that are sort of related. The first is, what does everyone think will happen with Governor Cuomo's requirement that each community review policing, and what does each panelist envision that Cuomo had in mind when he issued the mandate requiring submission of a community plan to reimagine the police? If we want, I mean, I don't, AJ and Dwayne, if you want to chime in first, and then we'll work our way down just what people's thoughts are on that.
Go ahead,
on the
Dwayne.
expectations there.
Okay. As it relates to what Cuomo's intentions are, I'm not going to speak to his intentions or what his mindset might have been. I will say that in this day and time, it's very popular to address long-standing issues that, quite frankly, has been political suicide to address before, and that's the systemic racism in the police department as well as other institutions in America. So right now is popular in order to weigh in on those. So addressing a popularity issue in a movement that is easy to get behind instead of standing in front of, that might be one issue. But as far as going to the teeth of what he recommended, I don't see, and I could be wrong, but maybe I missed something in regards to how exactly that's going to be implemented and measured. It's one thing to state that if there's not any type of communications between organizations, so community organizations and the police and legislation that they're going to withhold funding. It's one thing to say that there needs to be communication, but it's another thing to put in as far as hard measurables that's going to really address the systematic issues that people are facing, whether it's the hiring. And one of the things that I think is the biggest inhibitors of actually seeing real change is the blue wall of silence. And the blue wall of silence hurts both ways. It hurts the community, and it hurts officers that want to report bad officers and are scared basically of retaliation. And that's the real thing that I've spoken with officers regarding. So it cuts both ways, and I don't know if this formal initiative is really going to address that.
AJ, before you start, because I'm going to forget if I don't do it now, I'm just going to read the CLE code for those viewing it by video is 4122. I'll read it one more time. The CLE code is 4122. AJ, go ahead. I apologize.
Yeah, sure, no problem. So with respect to Governor Cuomo's order, it's concerning. I mean, of course, municipalities should be thinking about the role of policing in their communities and what the effects of that having and what the alternatives might be. However, what I'm seeing is municipalities are using it as an excuse not to do other things and to sort of slow down the momentum of the Black Lives Matter movement and their demands. So I've seen this in Rochester, I've seen this in Geneva. There are basically some elected officials and those in power are suggesting that, well, Governor Cuomo gave us a way to deal with policing, so now this is the way we're going to do it. However, people have been thinking about policing for a long time, or at least those who have been most affected by it have. And there are already plans in place and ways to try to deal with those things. And now to say, well, first we need to have another meeting of the minds before we can do anything else is, I think, a little bit of a red herring and a way to just kind of slow down the calls for systemic transformation that we're seeing from the Black Lives Matter movement. So I guess I'm a little bit cynical and skeptical of the plan, though of course municipalities should be thinking about the role policing plays in their community. But let's actually get something done, because a lot of people in Rochester and across New York State, they need change faster than what this Governor Cuomo's order is going to bring. We need change yesterday. So I don't think local elected officials here or anywhere else should be using Governor Cuomo's order as an excuse not to do other things with respect to policing.
Go ahead, Ashley. Oh, I would also note, when you're not speaking, panelists, if you don't mind muting your microphone, I think we're getting a little bit of an echo.
So I think that the conversation nationally has been a long time coming. However, I think you cannot use the master's tools to dismantle the master's house. It is a very dangerous thing when we ask systems to think about creating new systems, when all of these systems was built and are steeped in white supremacy. When we talk about the police department, the majority of it is cis white men. And that is a scary, scary thought for folks who look like me and live in our community. And when we talk about a system rethinking, how to police and what communities look like, we get things like from slavery to Jim Crow, from Jim Crow to mass incarceration. It's all the same system with a different face. And I think if we're gonna have these conversations, we need to ask the community to rethink what policing looks like to us and what safety looks like to us, and bring the police into that conversation. But asking the police to think about that when the system itself is steeped and built on white supremacy is dangerous.
Go ahead, Chief Cathaldi.
Well, so my thoughts on the reimagining what police looks like. It's a very short amount of time. I certainly don't want to be political, but it's a short amount of time to get this done. And I agree with what Ashley said. We, the police, need the consent of the people to do good policing. And the way we're going to get that is listening to the community and seeking community feedback. And one of the issues that I see in that is whether it be the police or the local municipality, we always seem to be leaving out a stakeholder. We do not have enough stakeholders at the table. I sit on a couple of different alliances, and every time I go to those alliance meetings, They are the same people sitting at the same table. And we need to be much more inclusive and reach out to those stakeholders in the community. I do like that aspect of it because, again, I'm going to go back to what policing looks like. We need to ask the community and seek their input and get hard data. The one thing that I must admit I didn't like was it seems like there's a finality to it. When the local law is signed on April 1st, 2020, it almost seemed like there was a finality to it. And that's not the case. There's never going to be a finality to it. We've been working very hard to build trust and legitimacy in the community. And as much as I think we were doing a really good job, and I've posed this question many times, let's wipe away all the past sins of policing and all the past sins of racism and start fresh today. And if I did that today in the same incident or another incident similar to what the crime perpetrated against George Floyd happened in Minneapolis happens tomorrow, we're right back to where we started from. So it's a double-edged sword. I don't think there's going to be a finality to it. Yes, we can pass a local law in each municipality, kind of what policing is going to look like, but that's not the end of it. The conversation needs to continue because we're always going to be evolving.
Go ahead, Ashley. You're muted. Ashley, you're muted.
Sorry, just wanted to say, if we erase slavery, Jim Crow, mass incarceration, if we erased all of that racism, if we erased all of that bigotry, if we lived in a different society, what happened to George Floyd wouldn't happen, because that doesn't happen to white men. So I just, like, when we say things like that, I want us to really hold it and like really realize who these things are happening to. If those things did not exist, if we didn't have a history of that, and people were really created equally, and people were really equal in this country, George Floyd wouldn't have happened. Just like it doesn't happen in suburban communities, just like it doesn't happen on Park Avenue.
That leads into a little bit of one of the other questions that were posed, and I think it's originally submitted for AJ, but others might want to opine on it too. And the question is, what's the status of disclosure of police disciplinary actions? I imagine the question is locally, but maybe that you have information. That's
yeah. My understanding is that the Rochester Police Department is planning to release all the disciplinary records that they have online. If I recall correctly, the goal is to get it up by early 2021. And that's where we are. However, there are some concerns, and even with respect to that, because one, they likely don't have their disciplinary records for the entire length of an officer's career. Rather, they probably get rid of their records after a certain number of years. I don't know if it's 5 or 7 or 3 or somewhere in that ballpark, but we're likely to not receive an officer's full disciplinary history. We're going to receive the disciplinary history that the police department keeps track of and currently has access to. Further, there are some police unions, I believe in New York City, have challenged whether or not those disciplinary records should include complaints that have not been sustained by some sort of disciplinary agency, whether or not those records should be released. And if it were to be found that those records cannot be released, that would be a huge impediment to transparency, because one of the problems we know from Rochester and other places in New York is that the sustain rate for these complaints over the past several years has been abysmally low. I believe, if I recall the statistic correctly, over the past 15 years or so, it's something like less than 3% of complaints have been sustained by the chief of police in Rochester. So if only that 3% of cases, if only those cases get released, that's not going to be much information at all that the community can draw on to learn from about how we can improve the situation in the community. So although, of course, it's great that 50A got repealed, it's still an open question about how much transparency that's actually going to deliver.
Go ahead, Ashley.
And I know we at NYCLU, we've done a FOIA request for these records, as well as reached out to the city to see what this release will look like. And what I can tell you from what we found out is that only that 3% will be released. From our understanding, the law gives some discretion to each county or each municipality to be able to decide what records they're going to release and what records they aren't. But from what I've gathered, for the city of Rochester, only founded accusations will be released, which is almost little to none, which is also a problem.
Chief Cathaldi, did you have a thought on the release of disciplinary records?
Yeah, so we are actually working through that, and we've received numerous FOIL requests for our 50A. So we have to remember, you know, I'm not a lawyer, but looking back when this law was, this is a 44-year-old law. And when it was repealed, there's really no foundation to look at some of the definitions within the law, technical infractions, what's unfounded, what is discipline. And it really puts chiefs and municipalities in a very difficult position, because if we don't follow the FOIL law correctly, or we release something that should not have been released, we're going to be sued by the individual officer for an unwarranted invasion of privacy. You know, I want to stay, and I've met with LaRon, and I've met with the other chiefs. The chiefs, we're about transparency. We want to make those records transparent, but I think we have to do so in a very thoughtful process and make sure that we're following the law. Back to what was asked about some of the recent court decisions, there's a court decision, I believe it's pending on August 18th out of the Southern District. I've read some opinions on the committees for open government out of the city of Syracuse. The Buffalo PBA, I believe, has filed a grievance as well on the release and what exactly gets redacted, what is open for negotiation and bargaining. I hope to have my personnel file available, hopefully no later than next week. I know the chief of police in the city of Rochester has done the same. So we're getting there, but we have to do this in a very thoughtful process. Otherwise, we are going to expose the municipality to litigation. And as you can imagine, employment records and releasing employment records could be very litigious.
And someone can jump in who can answer this, but do the released records, would they include incidents where there's interfamilial or spousal incidents with an officer's spouse or a member of the officer's family?
That's a good question, and we've asked that question. That could be an unwarranted invasion of privacy, bringing in a family member or spouse if it's involving the case of, say, domestic violence, infidelity in a marriage. That could be an unwarranted invasion of privacy. And stop and think just for 1 minute. Look in your own personal lives. Look back what you did 10 or 15 years ago. Would you want, and if you've learned from those mistakes, and God knows I've made enough mistakes in law enforcement for the last 25 years. You know, I believe in second chances, and that goes on both sides of the fence, not only for police officers, but for citizens, and sometimes third chances. If we can correct bad behavior and we can redeem an officer, whether that's through discipline or some type of counseling, I'm all for that. But that's not to say that, you know, there are officers in general that need to be terminated. When you have officers, and you read about them in the paper just like I do, someone that's had a disciplinary issue, 18 complaints of excessive use of force, those officers need to be disciplined. Those officers need to be terminated, but they still have due process rights. And it's very difficult, not only in the policing profession, look at the teaching profession as well. Sometimes it's easier to keep an employee away from the public rather than go through a termination proceeding that is very costly.
Is there an argument to be made that since police officers serve the public, that in this situation, they're not merely private citizens whose past mistakes and lives shouldn't be on display, but because they work for the public, they carry guns, there is a history of over-policing or violence against certain communities that the public has more of a right to know about their history versus your average private citizen?
So I think so. We can look at the police officer who killed George Floyd. We can even look at the police officer who shot Simone Simmons right here in Rochester. Both of those police officers had extensive records, right? Most of those complaints were unfounded. So yes, I think to whom much is given, much is required across the board, including police officers that police and over-police neighborhoods and wear guns. I think also when we talk about police records, and I'm not unreasonable, I do think there should be a level of privacy, but regular citizens get this same scrutiny. If you're arrested for a crime, whether you're found guilty or not, you can still see it. People can still see that. So why is it any different if a police officer is accused of misconduct? I don't understand.
Go ahead,
Yeah, and
AJ.
so one other point I wanted to make is, so with respect to the risk of litigation from officers whose disciplinary records are released to the public, I think we should be more concerned about the risk of litigation from police misconduct cases if we allow those sort of officers to stay on the force. We've seen huge expenses in the city of Rochester related to these settlements for police brutality. And that's the sort of litigation I would like to try to, find ways, to inhibit, by having less instances of misconduct, not necessarily the risk of litigation that an officer might not want his records to be released.
Chief Cathaldi, this sort of leads into this one of these next topics, which is in terms of screening police officers or training on race relations. A lot of people look at what happened to George Floyd and say, how could that officer not have let up in that time span? And how did someone not know that that guy needed to go? And so what are your thoughts on either screening officers for biases, or can police training improve, related to race relations, really impact that or improve on that?
As far as so I've been asked this question, and I've given it some thought. Training in policy. What training could you possibly give a police officer to tell that police officer not to put their knee on someone's neck when they're telling you they can't breathe? That is not a policy issue. That is not a training issue. That is a human being issue. And so, and that goes back to some of, through the hiring process. We have a pretty lengthy hiring process here in Brighton. If we hire a person off of the civil service list, they obviously have gone through the civil service process. They will submit themselves to a psychological background examination through a licensed psychologist. And what we look for here in Brighton is we look for people who are conscientious, people who have empathy and compassion. Those are some of the qualities that we look for. After they pass a psychological exam, that person would then either go to a police academy, or if they're a lateral transfer officer, they would go through a field training program. And the police academy lasts at a minimum, I believe it's up to 700 hours of training right now. There are components of in that training, bias awareness, implicit bias awareness training. We actually do it here. But again, I think it goes back to maturity, life skills, conscientiousness. Can it be trained? I don't really know if it can be trained. If you have a person that's a callous individual, we try to weed those people out. And I'm speaking for the town of Brighton. I believe we do a very good job. The citizenry in the town of Brighton demand and expect a very high level of service. And with my 20 plus years here in Brighton, I've been accustomed to what I know the citizens here in this community want in police officers. And I would like to think that each police chief is looking for those same high qualities and traits in their officers. But a lot of it, and this could, I'm sure, would segue into another conversation, the civil service hiring process, the promotion process. How do we diversify our police departments? Those are all issues that we're looking at and we struggle with every day.
Go ahead, Ashley.
I want to say sorry I'm talking so much, but you guys invited me to the panel. So I think as a human being, when we talk about like trainings and then, for anti-racist training and implicit bias training, for me, and I know like how closed-minded I used to be, I don't think that you can train away implicit bias. I don't think that you can train away racism. And I think the only thing that does that is experience. So I think police officers should volunteer in the neighborhoods they police, at the Boys and Girls Club, rec centers, whatever that may be. I'm not naive enough to think that all police officers are horrible people, right? We're talking about the culture of policing. Some of them are. We have an example with George Floyd. I'm going to also say Sylvan Simmons. But those are not things you can train away. Only experience can break away at those things. And I really think that if officers are going to police in our neighborhoods, they need to volunteer in our neighborhoods.
That implicates another question that was asked to a couple of them about community policing and community relations and being involved with the community. And Dwayne and AJ, you may be able to opine on this one initially, because I'm assuming it impacts the contracts that police have. Whether police officers are or should be required to live in the jurisdictions where they police, and what, if any, sort of obligations do they have to be involved in the community that they're policing?
So
Go ahead, Dwayne.
I guess contractually, what obligations do they have? It's whatever is agreed upon in the CBA. I believe Buffalo requires them to live in the municipality, live in the city for, 6 months or so. And then after that, they can move out of the city. Rochester doesn't have that requirement at all. So that's something that can be mandated through the collective bargaining agreement as far as a police officer or civil servant being required to live in the city that they're going to be assigned to policing. As far as not obligations, but should they, and I guess it goes one and the same. Yes, they should be volunteering in the communities wherein they police. It's hard to shoot someone when you know someone. I mean, it boils down to that. The more familiarity you have with the children, the more familiarity you have with the adults there, it goes to whether or not you see people as human beings versus you see some people as herds that need to be rounded up, policed, and detained. So it goes a long way as far as being in the community, and also in the line of work that police officers have. Oftentimes they see the worst of people. How do you counteract that? You mandate that they see or have open opportunities to see the best of people, so that they're in the community more at different events, that in the not in the schools as far as truancy officers or policing in the schools, but at school events, sporting events, things of that nature. So there needs to be an emphasis on being more involved in the community, not just I went there for a visit, but actually being involved.
And if I could chime in, just my understanding is that there is some state law issues that concern where police officers and firefighters in particular are, whether or not municipalities are allowed to impose residency requirements. I can't quote it to you right now, but my understanding is the New York State Public Officers Law limits Rochester, the municipality's ability to impose residency requirements on officers. I think in the past, the city may have tried to incentivize living in the city by offering bonuses to officers who would live in the cities or something along those lines. But the police union in Rochester actually fought against those incentive programs. So again, we see the police union sort of doing everything it can to sort of prevent any sort of transformation of the, here. But I just say that to say that some municipalities don't have the ability to impose these residency requirements, and change would need to happen at the state level in order to give municipalities that power.
And if I just to piggyback on one last thing, as far as being involved in the community and residency, I think there is some leeway as far as legislatively, as far as enacting that. But to give everyone an idea of it, and AJ is familiar with this, that if you're bringing in, if the police union is bringing in a presenter or a trainer, that, you know, their claim to fame is shoot first, ask questions later. And that's what they're paying to be trained and brought in. That gives you every idea as far as how they view the community in which they're policing.
Right. And one other thing I wanted to mention sort of harkens back to a discussion we were having earlier, but it's sort of about sort of where crime is happening. And we can, you know, and I just wanted to point out that when we think about crime, that we think about it in sort of a socially constructed way. And we don't, when we think about someone, shoplifting something from Wegmans or from, a grocery store, we think of that as, petty larceny or a crime. But we don't think about if that same grocery store were to underpay their workers, wage theft. That's not considered a crime. Yet it's likely that a lot of these large employers, commit those sort of wage theft violations, on a somewhat regular basis, and maybe even to an even greater extent than the petty larceny that we see in our communities, if you look at it across the country. So all I wanted to say is that sometimes when we think about, communities that have a lot of crime, we don't think about the large institutional players, the big banks, the big employers that also commit violations that just aren't classified as crimes and that we don't often think about as crimes, but are just as, or even more so harmful to the community.
I'm going to let Chief Cathaldi chime in, and then Ashley, I'll let you answer before we move on.
Yeah, AJ, you're exactly right. And it's a public officers law, and there is no requirement to live within the municipality in which you serve. I believe, if I'm correct, the city of Rochester, in order to take the test, you have to have a residency in the city of Rochester. But then what happens after they're hired? They move out. And I bring this back and I asked this question to myself. If you had the greatest police officer in the world, he or she, whatever that description is for you, would you really care where they lived if they policed you and had the consent to police you and they were a part in the fabric of your community? It didn't matter where they live, or would you take an officer that may be substandard that does live in the community? So I think there's a dueling set of factors there. As far as like volunteering in the community, we're not allowed to do that. I believe it'd be a violation of the wage and hour law. We've had police explorer programs here in Brighton, and a lot of those events take place outside the officer's normal working hours. And if we can't find an agreement where we can reassign an officer, then it equates back to overtime issues, but we cannot have an officer volunteer in the police department without being paid.
I don't know that it's is that only if the volunteering is in their capacity as a police officer, or would that apply to volunteering in a soup kitchen?
Oh, no, well, if we mandated that person, then it would be in their capacity as a police officer. But I think the greater question is cultural competency. Do they understand the communities in which they serve? That's what this question is. Do they understand the communities in which they serve? And what I hear continuously back from community members and community forums, that may not necessarily be the case. And that's what I hear at a lot of these meetings, that they don't understand the communities in which they serve. And we have to do a better job at that. And a lot of the discussions that I have is the chief of police that I hear and I understand, the officers on the street don't understand. And they need to hear these same conversations.
Go ahead, Ashley. And before you start, we got a message from a participant that said, tell Ashley she's fantastic and her viewpoint is vital and there's no need to apologize for talking too much.
Oh, thank you, whoever that was. So I was gonna say two things, and I'm glad I went last because I was Googling it to make sure I was correct. But when we talk about city resident requirements, Buffalo just expanded their requirement from 6 months to 7 years that a police officer has to live in the city. And this came up on a panel that me and the chief was on 2 weeks ago, and I didn't want to, reply without knowing what I was talking about. But they just expanded that, and it just lapsed, and they're getting ready to redo it again. So it is possible. One. The other thing, the question about, would you rather have an officer who live in the city, who, maybe not live in the city, but was a good officer? When you talk about cultural competency and understanding the people that you police, the best way to do that is to live in the city. And with a question like that, it's like asking me, do I want Trump or Joe Biden? Like, they're both trash. Like, sorry, but you can't pick two evils and say, which evil do you want? The best way to get cultural competency is to live in our community and interact with the people who live here every day. No shade about Trump and Biden.
One question that was submitted was whether any of the panelists can provide examples of recent successes where a municipality or community has made efforts to institute reforms of policing that were considered successful. I think people talk about Camden a bit, but that was 10 years ago and done, I think, for different purposes.
Yeah, what little bit I know about Camden is just that there was a lot of corruption in the police department, and the department was basically dismantled. But I think many of those police officers, I think it was a pretty high percentage, were actually hired back into that police department. And that goes back to what we were talking about earlier. What do you want the police to do? I've read some of the articles on Camden. In New York City, they have something called CompStat, and they measure an officer's, what's an officer do for 8 hours a day? How many tickets do they write? How many arrests do they make? And sometimes we lose sight of the fact we have to be very careful that we're not installing and instilling quotas on officers. And what do we want to measure as police executives? What does that officer accomplish for that 8-hour tour of duty? Would we rather have an officer out writing, say, traffic tickets, or would we rather have that officer spending time doing those community engagement events, installing child safety seats, bike rodeos, community picnics, and what have you? Because I saw a lot of that was happening in Camden.
I was going to say Camden too, but it's such a slippery slope because they were so corrupt. So I feel like, I can't remember who, but I feel like a town or county just, their city council just voted to defund the police, but we're not at implementation yet. So I really don't have an example, but what I would say is that I would encourage us to be the example. If we don't have one, we have the opportunity to be that example or to create that blueprint for other people to kind of follow.
A number of, oh, sorry, go ahead. Go ahead, AJ.
Refer back to something that was discussed before, but the CAHOOTS program, I think, where that's been implemented has been one sort of change that's had some success, though limited. So yeah, I agree with Ashley that we need to go much further and to see real success.
There were a number of questions that came in regarding the police responding to people in mental health crises, and I know that we did touch on that earlier, but a few questions came in that were specific. I don't know if the one about the Rochester Police Department could be answered, but for Chief Cathaldi, there's a question: if a person is in crisis and the Brighton police respond, is there any policy about not charging that individual with an assault if it turns out that there is a physical altercation, or what are the policies around a situation like that?
I think that would be fact specific. If if someone's clearly in crisis, it would depend on the level of crime. Obviously, that would be determined in a court of law, and we would work in consultation with the district attorney to determine mental competency. But that's really going to be fact specific.
And what sort of training is provided in terms of de-escalating those situations so they don't necessarily get to the point where that would have to be a question?
Sure. So like I said earlier, we provide our officers, we have 100% of our staff, with the exception we have one new hire that's going through training. So 100% of our staff have been certified in mental health first aid, which we brought here to the Brighton Police Department 2 years ago. We actually sent an officer down to Atlanta, Georgia for a whole week worth of training to bring that training back here to the police department. And there's a very heavy emphasis on de-escalation. And I would ask panelists, what does de-escalation mean to them? It means to me slowing the process down, not putting an officer in a situation where they're going to have to respond with force. So there's a lot of components of de-escalation in that. We also have 25% of the staff here are crisis intervention trained, which is a much higher level of training. It's a 40-hour class on mental health awareness, mental health issues, pharmacology, and those officers are in the field on every shift. So as far as de-escalation goes, it's really taking a break and not forcing a situation into something that it's not. In de-escalation, I could look back and point out a specific example with the Tamir Rice shooting in Cleveland, Ohio. If you watch that video, that was poor tactics. You saw a police responding to a person with a gun, and the police car actually drove within, I believe, 5 feet of the young man that had the fake gun, and the young man was shot and killed. That's poor tactics. That's not de-escalation. That's escalating a situation. So poor tactics and poor tactics that a police officer use at a scene. If they use the proper tactics, that's a form of de-escalation.
Ashley, before I have you go, the other question was the percentage of the Rochester Police Department that are certified in mental health. That you mentioned 2 different certifications. You know that for your police department. I don't know, Chief Cathaldi, if you know the numbers for Rochester.
I do not know. I could get those numbers for you. I know they have the same partnership. It's on a much bigger scale than what we have here in the Brighton Police Department. As I said earlier, they had it was over 2,000 interventions in the last quarter between the Office of Mental Health and their fit team members, but I couldn't comment on how many they have.
Okay, Ashley, go ahead.
So I wanted to just point out again that de-escalation looks different in different communities, especially when you're talking about and you're bringing in implicit bias. We saw this a couple of weeks ago when the man on Bay Street was acting erratic and he broke a bottle in the street, and he was had mental issues and was charged with assault of the police officer. You can talk to his family, you can talk to his neighbors, and everyone around him knows that he had mental health issues. So when we talk about de-escalation in Brighton versus de-escalation in the city, when you're talking about Black people and white officers who automatically off the cuff feel intimidated because it's a big Black man or, a loud Black woman or whatever it may be. So like when we talk about that, I just want us to really put it in perspective and what it looks like in different communities.
If I could just talk about de-escalation, part of that also comes into your marketing. And that's, don't say that you're interested in de-escalating or actually finding solutions. And then the sheriffs put forth that bogus proposal that seeks to increase resisting arrest to a felony and increase failure to retreat to a felony, plus a slew of other type of legislative efforts that are meant to escalate situations because we know who those will be used upon.
Can I respond? Can I say something to that?
Yes, I was actually going to ask the panelists their views on that proposal. Go ahead, Ashley.
So, one of the proposals that the sheriff's office put out to me is just bogus on so many different levels. But when we talk about dismantling these systems, like we need to also think about the role that we play as organizations and individuals in these same systems and how we prop them up and hold them up. We know that this legislation that the sheriffs is putting on the table, we know the communities that it's going to impact. We know the people who are going to be in jail behind those, and that is Black and brown people. RBBA just partnered with tons of grassroots organizations in Rochester to write a letter to our legislators to say that we do not agree with these reforms that police officers are putting on the table. And for some reason, other bar associations didn't sign on to that letter. They didn't, agree with that. And for me, we have to take a look and see how we uphold these systems. How do we uphold white supremacy systems that impact poor people and people of color? And it's just continually disappointing when we have these conversations, but then it's time to actually put your feet to the ground and do something about it, and nothing is done. Or you don't, you back away.
I will jump in just there, and I'll let others speak to it who know more than I do, because I know they are listening. I do know that some, to speak for some of the other bar associations here, they are limited in some ways that RBBA is not in terms of advocacy that they can engage in. So it may very well be that many members of those bar associations would have been supportive of signing on to that letter. And that can be a conversation for another day, but my suspicion is that it's the limitations that are imposed on the other bar associations more so than its members being unwilling to engage on it. Go ahead, AJ, and then Dwayne.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry, you were unmuted, so I thought you wanted to talk. I can move to Dwayne. You're muted, Dwayne.
All right. I think to Ashley's point, though, there comes a time when we have to stop hiding behind taking a quote unquote political stance because it rocks the boat. I don't think this is not a Democrat or Republican issue. This is not, as far as I know, that the proposal put forth by the sheriff's association is coming out saying, yay, we're putting this forth because we're Democrats, or yay, we're putting this forth because we're Republicans. It's apolitical. And I'm sorry, but if there was a proposal on there saying that we're going to do X, Y, and Z, and it's going to negatively impact the Jewish community, I don't think that other people would find it saying that, oh, well, we can't take a stance because, you know, X, Y. It's not political. And we need to call it out and stop hiding behind the fact that we can't sign on to certain things, saying that it's for a political reason, or we're an organization that can't take a political position. We have to remain apolitical. There is nothing political about some of these situations. So hiding behind that shows cowardness, in my opinion. Not only that, I'm sorry, but if you are about real systematic change, is going to take going through and challenging what do our bylaws say about certain situations. How far can we push the envelope versus we can't do that.
That makes sense. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I attended a couple meetings that the sheriff was at, and he did take quite a bit of heat, especially, and I don't know all the proposals, just for explanation, in my position as the chief of police here in Brighton, I belong to the New York State Association of Chiefs of Police, and that represents a very wide group. It represents people, chiefs of police in New York City, all the way to Buffalo, all the way up in the North Country. So each community has a very wide-ranging population demographics that they serve. And sometimes, I'm not going to apologize for the sheriff, and this goes back to what I've been saying all along, is stakeholder input. I was at some of those meetings, and the sheriff took a lot of heat for that resisting arrest charge. And what does that ultimately look like if that were to pass? And if you don't know, that did not pass. That's not going to be picked up by the Senate Assembly. Let's just face fact. It's not. I think it's already dead. It was dead on arrival. And whether that's a political gesture by the Sheriff's Association, the Greater Sheriff's Association, or not, I don't know. But I can tell you where I stand on the fact. I don't think we need more laws on the books. And that's across the board. We don't need more laws. I believe we have enough laws on the books. And I don't think I would have supported those. And I don't think the sheriff actually supported those. He just kind of got looped into, I'm a part of the Sheriff's Association, but he can speak for himself on that matter.
Who's over the Sheriff's Association, Chief Cathaldi?
I don't know who the president of the association is, but it's a fraternal organization. Each sheriff belongs, to my knowledge, each sheriff belongs to it. And I think I don't know how you get into it. I can tell you here in New York State, I belong to it because I'm the chief of police and I pay dues to it. And it's more of a fraternal organization, but it has a wide representation across the state.
I'm going to chime in here because we're coming up on the end of our allotted time, and I do want to give each panelist a couple of minutes to do sort of a wrap up. I do want to pass along a message from the president of GRAWA, who said that she hasn't received a proposal to sign on to anything or review, but she is happy to review and stand behind and with RBBA where and how they can. I know that there was a discussion recently at the coalition meeting about a presentation being made to the MCBA board or committee that would be charged with preparing something related to that proposal. So I know that it is being discussed by the other bar associations, and there's definitely a lot of interest in actively trying to get out in front of it and comment on it. I'm going to give everyone a couple of minutes. Looks like I have about 6 minutes left, so like a minute and a half to just sort of sum up. I will also plug at the very end, the coalition is having a program on September 16th on issues of voter suppression. It's another Zoom program in the evening, and we'll circulate invites and promote it, but we invite everybody to join us. Let's go in the order that we spoke. So Ashley, you can go ahead.
So I would just say that these are very difficult conversations and they're intense conversations. So first, just thank you to all the panelists for being a part, and thank you for MCBA and Jill Paperno for inviting me. I would just continue to encourage us to, one, do the research, one, challenge our own selves to reimagine what public safety looks like, even when it's difficult. And then also to continue to have these very difficult conversations, not with just each other, but at the dinner table, at the Thanksgiving table, with your family and with your friends. And hopefully, we can all be better.
Okay, AJ?
Yeah, so briefly, I want to circle back to one other issue that we came up before, but I was sort of trying to figure out what was going on with it. But that's so residency requirements for police officers. It looks like Buffalo has been working with the New York State Legislature to get that done. So basically, the New York State Legislature would have to approve it in order to allow for the residency requirements in Buffalo. And I think Rochester and other municipalities across the state should be looking to do similar things from the legislature. But I think all this goes to show is that we still have a lot of work to do, both at the state level and the local level, in terms of dealing with the problems of policing that we've seen in our communities. And I also just want to reiterate sort of what I started out saying, which is the problem aren't the legal impediments here. There are political impediments and failures of imagination. That's really where we see obstacles to transforming how policing works, or transforming how we deal with these social problems in our community. The union contract is subject to appropriations by council. City Council in Rochester has the power to defund the police if they so choose. It's just a matter of if they can find ways to deal with these issues in a way that doesn't involve a gun, that doesn't involve incarceration. And I challenge all elected officials locally and across the state to be starting to do that.
Go ahead, Dwayne.
I want to thank the panel for coming on. It was a great discussion. I hope that it's more than a discussion, though, and that everyone stays involved, stays attuned to what's going on, and join some type of movement, whether it's a letter writing movement, a calling campaign, volunteering, or reaching out to police officers. And one of the things that we touched on briefly that we really didn't explore, and I spoke with John Elmore on this, who's a former state trooper, and that is trying to find imaginative ways to dismantle the blue wall of silence. It hurts both sides. And I don't think enough is being talked about and done about how do you keep officers safe that want to report bad officers, and what does the community involvement look like in order to help facilitate that. So, thank you.
Chief?
Again, thank you so much for the invitation. It was an excellent panel presentation. I'm glad I got to meet Dwayne and AJ, very knowledgeable in their fields. And I do hope that these conversations continue. I do hope, if nothing else, we can build relationships between the police and the communities we serve, and build and continue to build upon the trust and legitimacy, because we need that. I think our communities need it. It's a very difficult time in this country. It is with the global pandemic, this recession and job loss that we're going through. I don't yet think that we have seen the negative effects from COVID-19 and the economic downturn. I don't think we've seen the full effect of that yet. And I'm worried about what our communities are going to look like in a few years. So hopefully we can build these relationships. And again, thank you so much for having me.
I want to thank all of the panelists for joining. This was an excellent panel. We never have enough time to talk about everything we want to talk about. We definitely did not get to all of the questions. I tried to group them as well as I could, but if your question was not delivered, I apologize. We can feed them to the panelists afterwards and see if we can get you some responses. If you follow up with me, either personally, or the email address for the coalition is rsjcoalition@gmail.com. And if you want to submit your question to that email address, we can get it answered for you, whoever it was directed to. So thank you again, everybody. We really appreciate you joining, and hopefully we'll have some action and more of these conversations going forward.
Thank you.